Welcome to Life as a Seed. I'm Johan, your host, and in this series on narratives, we are discussing how narrative shape our lives. In this video, which is part 3, we will be discussing how we adopt a narrative and how it impacts our lives. So this follows from the first 2 videos, which the first one was the introductions into narratives, and the second one was seeking of a narrative in order to navigate life. So in this third video, we are looking specifically on how an individual adopts a new narrative and its impact on the individual's life. I will follow on, some of the examples that I used from my own life, from pre to post-apartheid in South Africa, and how it shaped me as an individual character, and how narrative was foundational in that transformation within individual lives, but also the lives of a nation as a whole. So to just recap, the adoption of a narrative happens because we seek out low-resolution views of reality as individuals. We seek just enough detail in order to make sense of the world you live in, our own positioning and our own role within it. This low-resolution view gives us a context. It gives us a place in which our own story and our own life and our own objectives make sense to us. We use this low resolution sort of view of reality in order to self-orientate and to self-navigate. So we will go further into just some more dynamics on this as we look at how we adopt a new narrative. And what is added in this is the in-group dynamics, where we move within groups and how narratives change within groups and how we are forced to move with the group as the narrative changes or evolves. And then furthermore, we will look at, as a narrative changes or we adopt a new narrative, how it challenges our own personal values and beliefs, and how we need to remold ourselves in order to reconcile our own personal beliefs and values with those represented by a narrative. So also just to just recap a bit from the previous videos, it's just to highlight again is that we adopt a narrative like a single 2-dimensional view in a multi-dimensional, ever-evolving reality. We pick specific slices or views of reality in order to be able for it to be useful to us. Too many views, too many perspectives are things that we do not normally associate with good navigation and making sense of the world. So on a personal level, this is what we naturally do. It's to limit complexity and to simplify my own life, my own positioning, my own orientation. So we will look at the process of how we adopt a new view, how we select one, how we pick them, and for what reasons we pick them, and how we then process that new view of reality in order to for us to be able to move forward in life. And we will focus on 4 particular things that happens within our own life and how we choose a new narrative or an adapted, remodeled narrative. The first one is self-navigation. If a new narrative provides enhanced navigation or a new path forward, then there's a strong incentive to choose that narrative. The second one is self-enhancement. Is if a narrative has the ability to enhance my life, then again, there's a strong appeal to adopt, such a narrative. The third one is in-group dynamics, where our own sort of communities and groups that we belong to also move, together in a narrative space. They're also embedded into a story world, and we are forced to move with the group if we want to stay in the group, and therefore the in-group dynamics becomes important as narratives evolve. And then finally, we will look at beliefs and values and how that needs to be processed. So to start with the first one, which is self-navigation. In general, people navigate their lives based on unrecognized patterns. These patterns emerge in our lives through hereditary, our family upbringing, in-group associations, our culture, education, our national story, and so on. These patterns develop into implicit bias. In other words, it's subconscious, it's unknown, but these patterns become sort of the ways in which we navigate our own lives, and we process information based on unconscious associations and feelings. We do not realize that we do this unless we specifically become aware of them and begin to focus on how we process information based on such patterns. So what basically happens is that individuals map their own lives on top of familiar patterns, story walls, master plans, and so forth. So it's that our own story is embedded in that, and it's mapped, on top of those unknown implicit bias, stories, and paths. So when life changes or new information comes or new things evolve, we are forced to adapt narratives, to pick new narratives in order to make sense as the story world evolves. We need to do this in order to make sense of the world that we live in. So as this underlying story world changes, it forces the culture, it forces individuals to adapt in order to navigate life successfully. These changes in the underlying story world forces us then to also evolve. The key thing is that as it moves, narratives begin to move in different directions, and we're basically forced to make choices between different narratives or different stories as they evolve. And the key thing here is that we are strongly influenced by our family upbringing, our culture, our own history, that we would move along the same lines, that even as it changes, it's impossible for us to just throw out the old patterns and have new patterns. We seek ways in which it makes sense to us that our own culture, our own family story, our own national story migrates and move, and then we sort of do the same. So when we find a compatible view or perspective, we adopt that as an additional or a new view in order so that we can self-navigate from that point forward. So on a second level is we evaluate new narratives based on the possibility for self-enhancement. So if there's a possibility that if I adopt a new narrative, that it provides for me enhancements such as money, promotion, recognition, safety, etc., then it becomes a very strong incentive to choose that particular narrative. And especially this works especially well if I can choose a narrative or a story or a path where there is no cost when it comes to self-enhancement. Others, when I can get free stuff, or I can get miraculous things, or things can just drop down in my lap, it can fall from heaven. That's very, very appealing because there's no cost involved. And we will even see in the example that I'll be using that those things happen quite often. And it is quite a strong appeal to people to choose a narrative that is based on free or miraculous things. So thirdly is the in-group dynamics that involves. Now this is very, very important, and it begins to play into our really understanding how our lives might be shaped not by choices that are in our control, but by choices that other people make. So in-group dynamics refers to the solidarity that a group can provide. In-group represents communities of shared interests that provide a sense of stability and strength. And all people need some sort of groups within their lives, even if it's just family or marriage or a group of friends. It is important to not underestimate the influence of in-group dynamics. So when my in-group adopts a potential new narrative and the new story begins to be recycled and reprocessed, and eventually a group adopts a new position or a new narrative, it becomes very, very hard for an individual to not adopt the same narrative because they are conflicted between being part of the group, being one in the group, being a character within a group, and the narrative that might be changing. And they will make a choice between the narrative and the group. And most often people choose the group and then by default choose a new narrative. So within group dynamics, I would then, if a group adopts a new narrative, the character itself in my personal story, I also need to adapt. So I need to adapt my own role within the group based on the new narrative. So it becomes more complicated because now it's not just me redefining my own character, my own beliefs, but I also need to redefine my own role and character within the group and the role within the group as the group evolves. So on a fourth point, we look at the beliefs and values. So when potential new narratives evolve, we are forced to sort of check the compatibility of the beliefs, the values that comes from a new narrative based on our own. And we are sort of forced to look at these things, whether they're compatible and whether we can make peace with some sort of conflicts or changes that might be required in making those changes, within the narrative and even my own role as a character. So values refer to personal judgments of what is important or sacred in life. My values are the things that guide me and motivate me with regards to my attitudes and my actions. Beliefs, on the other hand, refers to an acceptance of that something is true without necessarily having proof for it. In other words, I believe things without having proof for them, but I believe that those things are true or they exist. So when we adopt a new potential narrative, we try to harmonize our own personal values and belief with those that comes forward out of a new narrative. And we harmonize it. So we harmonize our values, which is our personal sort of principles, and our beliefs, the things that we are not able to prove. But if we find that those things are not in conflict and they can move along, then we are more at peace to adopt a new narrative. If, however, there are conflicts, we need to make compromises with regards to our values and our beliefs in order to be able to adopt a new narrative or stay within a particular group. And this, can be quite a conflicting period in where we have to reevaluate our things. If the values and beliefs are too foreign to our current ones, then it becomes a challenge, and we might choose not to accept a new narrative. We might choose to leave a group, and we might be forced to take a different path. So as for the impact of adopting a new narrative, this becomes quite important because not many people think through the impacts of how the underlying story in their life and their own character within a story changes over time. So we seek out a new narrative or perspective for life because old narratives and perspectives have become insufficient, or they've become outdated. As such, these narratives fails to provide the low resolution answers to make sense of the world and to find meaning in it. So we are forced to do this because we are meaning-seeking, creatures. We need a sense of sense-making in this world in order to be able to function in this world. So we are all forced to do this. A new narrative demands that we make compromises with regards to our expectations and our views, and as such, we change not just our character, we also change our positioning, we change our perspective, we change the lens through which we see things. So it changes many dynamics in our lives slowly over time, and people don't necessarily realize the change that happens. And then they might wake up one day and realize that they are now a different character in a different story. They didn't really realize that this was happening, but this is now where they are. And they become disillusioned with the impact as a narrative and their own character has changed. So new narratives and answers, or answers to the nagging questions in our lives, changes us. It's not just that it necessarily provides better answers or new answers. It also is a time where we change, and we might change for the better or for the worse. So down on a personal level, it's quite important to understand that ourselves evolve as our story evolves. A key point is that we ourselves evolve as an enhanced or an adapted character embedded within an evolving narrative. Most people do not realize this. They do not realize how they change as their story changes. This evolution is dependent on our view of the world and how we see ourselves. This depends on the view of reality we choose and adapt as a best fit for our circumstances. So the key thing here is that the nature of self is far more embedded in the nature of the character. We are in an embedded story than we realize. We don't realize how the character we see ourselves as within an embedded story changes us as we navigate going forward. It's almost as if there are hidden layers of ourselves that are not revealed to us, but these hidden layers change, and it changes our view, it changes our perspective, it changes our ability to fit in to a group, it changes our beliefs and our values. So it has a very deep impact on our self and on the nature of self. The evolution of self is largely influenced by the evolution of the character it sees itself as, which again is largely influenced by the adopted narrative we choose as our preferred view or perception of reality. Now, the key thing here is that most of this evolution of ourselves, of the underlying character, of who we see ourselves as within a story, happens on a subconscious level. We do not realize that it happens. We We are not aware of the necessarily changes that evolves within our lives. But when we look back over a period of 5 or 10 years, we realize how we have changed and how those things have changed our lives. Now, linked onto this is the redirection of self. So as self evolves and it moves from one version of itself to a new version, it is also redirected. A new narrative is like a new door that opens along a path. Although this path might be similar, a new reigning narrative will become a different signal that we will recognize and follow. Once adopted, we will journey along a path that a new narrative provides. So the key thing here is that it's not just us that change, but also the direction changes. The path we take changes. The challenges will change. The landscape will change. The way we view the world and other people will change. And people sometimes just wake up one day and realize that the world they live in now is quite different from the world that they used to know. So we follow such a path because we chose the narrative because it was based on decisions that were based on self-enhancement, self-navigation, in-group dynamics, beliefs or values. But it's a new path and it's a risky path. We don't always know where it will take us, and it takes us on a different journey. Now, sometimes this is positive in people's lives, sometimes this is negative. And it's not that we always know where it will go. The challenge is that we try to adapt and adopt as we go along. And most of us do not realize enough how it changes us or how it changes the world around us. So, yeah, the understanding of narratives becomes very important. At this point, I trust that you see the importance of understanding the role of narratives and how it shapes our lives. Unfortunately, it is something that most people never realize. They don't realize how the underlying story they're embedded in changes them. So although most people do not understand or do not realize that it's happening, on the flip side, there are people in this world that make it their business to understand and manipulate narratives. The purpose of such, these are the type of people that create narratives, they shape narratives on purpose. And the reason why they do it is to influence the decisions that people make. Now, I call these people the masters of narratives. Once these masters can effectively influence the decisions other people are making regarding their own identity and direction in life, they can effectively control them indirectly and almost without them knowing it. So this is why it becomes very, very important that we must realize that self-navigation is normally not self-navigation. It is self-navigation embedded within a larger story world that is easily manipulated by people that understand how to create stories and how to shape stories in order to shape us. So, yeah, I want to go back to the story that I used, the example I used in video 2 with regards to the Rainbow Nation and my own role within it. And there I asked a particular question of how I changed from a soldier for apartheid in 1989 to a member of the Rainbow Nation in 1994, and how that happened. And the key question in that is that there was a new narrative there was a new narrative that was birthed in the nation. So as the narrative in South Africa changed, it allowed me as a character within that nation to adapt, because the underlying story world changed and it was transformed from a pre to a post-apartheid South Africa. So as the story changed, I was allowed to change as a character. And therefore, I had a new path. There was a new direction. So this is an example that I use just because it's quite stark and it's quite in a short space of time for people to see and to recognize. So I'm just going to go into a bit about the change that happened there and how it allowed for the adoption of a new narrative. So the Rainbow Nation was really birthed as a concept, as a master narrative. The key thing is the concept of the Rainbow Nation was a narrative that was developed and expanded by both religious and political leaders in the post-apartheid South Africa. And it started emerging from some televised appearances right after the 1994 elections. Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke in biblical terms about the end of the flood of apartheid and the arrival of a new dawn as symbolized by the Rainbow Nation. President Nelson Mandela continued, and he spoke about the Rainbow Nation at peace with itself and the world. So this metaphor was really birthed out of a religious and political context. And the masters of the narrative was quite evident. It was quite clear that it was orchestrated and it came from the highest levels of government and the political transition. So as a new narrative or a metaphor of the rebirth of a peaceful multicultural nation after the destruction and oppression of apartheid, this became the new master narrative, and it allowed for a wholesale change of vast numbers of people to change their own story world, to change their own story, their own character, and how they position themselves. So the key thing here is that I was allowed to become someone else. But the question is, did I really change? To what degree did the concept of a rebirth change me? Or was it just my story world in which I could reposition myself? And those are some of the key questions that are being asked in South Africa today on how real the Rainbow Nation really is. Or are people going back to what they feel was closer to their own story and closer to the story that they felt was akin to them? So this is sort of an example of how a new narrative is birthed, created, adopted on personal and on a national level. So as we come to the end of our video number 3, in the next video we will be looking at the masters of the narrative, and I will be discussing how there are different types of masters of the narrative and how they use their own objectives and their own knowledge of narratives to shape the story world in order to shape the lives of multiple people, and how we in the end must become aware that these things are done on purpose and purposefully in order to achieve alternative objectives that are not necessarily our own objectives, that are not necessarily within our own interest. And if we become aware of that and we begin to understand how that works, then we can begin to think through how we can become the master of our own narrative instead of being a subject to a character within someone else's story that are being manipulated and controlled by them. And thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. If you can, please like this video. If you can and you're interested in seeing more of it, please subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notifications of new videos as they are released. Thank you for watching.